Research references from Dr. Chris Kenobi, Dr. Joseph McCullough, and Christopher Diadamo show the progressive increase of the omega-6 as percent of our calories. Beginning in 1865, approximately 2.2 grams per day of omega-6s. By 1909, we were more than double that at 4.84 grams per day, around approximately 2% of our calories. By 1999, we were up to 7% of our calories, or 18 grams a day. By 2008, our omega-6 increase was almost 12% of our calories at 29 grams per day. Currently, our omega-6 is in excess of 30% of our calories. We are at 80 grams per day. Research from Lana Zegher in April of 2013 shows the increase of the dietary vegetable oil consumption versus butter, lard, and margarine. And as you can see, from 1909 to 2009, our butter, lard, and margarine have largely decreased, where our consumption of vegetable oils has massively increased. And this is really important. Prior to the 1850s, the omega-6s composed 1 to 2% of human fat tissue. These are dietary fats that came from saturated animal fats. For nearly 5,900 years, this has been the basis of the human diet, with no expression of degenerative diseases. However, currently, within the last 100 years, omega-6 comprise 20 to 30% of human fat tissue. And this results in a dietary fats that are coming from seed and vegetable oils. This shift can be traced back to the advent of putting seed oils in our food, trans fats, and hydrogenated vegetable oils such as Crisco. Vegetable and seed oils generate dramatic increases in adipogenesis, or fat creation. 43% of the U.S. population is currently medically obese. More than 72% of the U.S. population is considered overweight. And it's projected by 2030, at least half of all U.S. adults will be obese. Research from Dr. Chris Kenobi, just going back to 1959, Americans had 9.1% linoleic acid in their adipose tissue. By 1998, that had increased more than double to 18.5%. Currently, we are at in excess of 25% of adipose tissue contains the omega-6 linolenic acid. Vegetable oil consumption in the U.S. As you can see, there was a noticeable increase just after 1900. And where prior to we had been at 99% of added fats in our diet were from animal fats. We went from 0 to 80 grams a day in 145 years. And 80 grams of seed oil a day is approximately 720 calories. That's over 32% of the U.S. dietary intake. We have gone from virtually no obesity in the early to mid 1800s to 43% medically obese currently. In addition, in the 1980s, we had the dietary guidelines from the government demonizing saturated fats, and advocating for a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. One note I would like to interject here is when humans on this diet become metabolically dysfunctional and we have degenerative diseases, we have to assume that the livestock that we feed the same diet, our cattle, our hogs, our chicken, our turkeys, even farm-raised fish on a high seed oil consumption, have the same metabolic diseases and toxins in their systems. And so when we eat that food, we're not only getting the excessive omega-6s from the tissue, but we're also inheriting those cellular toxins, the 4-hydroxynonenal, the malondialdehydes, the oxidized linoleic acid metabolites, the acrylines, the carboxyethylpyrols. These are all cellular toxins and poisons that break down into all of these cellular dysfunction modes that cause disease. We have to recognize that those types of animals fed high seed oil diets are not only unhealthy, but they're also toxic. Look at the direct correlation between U.S. adult obesity versus total vegetable oil consumption from 1870 to 2018. Again, this is work from Dr. Chris Kenobi and others. This research shows that prior to the 1900s, there was very little obesity in the U.S. population, whereas by 2018, 42.5% of the U.S. adult population was medically obese. This research continues looking at the variable of sugar and vegetable oil consumption versus adult obesity from 1822 to 2018. Even though sugar consumption increased well before obesity increased, obesity increased when vegetable oil introduction was put into the food chain and we substituted stable saturated fats with unhealthy oxidizing seed oils. The research continues from 1975 to 2014. Vegetable oil, sugar consumption versus adult obesity in women. Vegetable oil increasing steadily from 1975 through 2014, as did the obesity rate, moving from 6.4 to 14.9, with sugar consumption being relatively stable all the way through the trial period. Obesity correlates with vegetable oil, not sugar consumption. While sugar consumption may have risen slightly by 5%, vegetable oil uptake was an 85% increase, with obesity up more than 2.3-fold. The same is reflected for obesity in men. Vegetable oil versus sugar consumption in relation to global adult obesity in men. 1975, 3.2% increased to 2014 at 10.8%. Sugar remaining very stable with a modest 5% increase, yet vegetable oil was up again 85%, and in men there was a 3.4-fold increase in obesity. Research again from Dr. Chris Kenobi. The timeline for obesity in the U.S. prior to the 19th century, 1900s, 1.2% obesity. By 1999, we were at 30.5% obesity, and by 2023, we are at 42.4% obesity. You can hardly say that this is a picture of health. You must eat more healthy polyunsaturated fats like Americans. If our cells fail, our organs will fail next. This will lead to the failure of our health. If we safeguard our cells, the rest of the metabolic system can function according to its intended genetic design. That's why it's so critical that we focus on building our cells with the right balance of essential fats. Because whether we like to realize it or not, our bodies are mostly essential fat construction. Our cells must have the right balance of healthy fats for their structure and their function operations. We may not like to admit it, but our brain is 80% fatty acids. Our cell membranes are the vast majority, 80 to 85% fatty acids. And it's critical that we have the stable, non-oxidizing fats in these cells and these organs so that they function properly. Additional research by Dr. Chris Kenobi shows us the timeline for heart disease in the U.S. At 1811 in Boston, there was no indication of heart disease or deaths. There were 25 sudden deaths, or 2.6% of deaths caused by sudden death. During the 19th century, there were 8 worldwide reports on myocardial infarctions. That is all. By 1897, Sir William Osler reports 6 cases of angina in the previous 21 years. No myocardial infarctions. Angina is ischemic chest pain. It's caused by a reduction of blood flow to the heart. By 1900, 12.5% of the deaths were due to heart disease, but this was valvular, caused by infection, not from chronic heart disease as a degenerative condition. John Herrick publishes the first known case of myocardial infarction in 1912 in the U.S. This was the first documented heart attack. In the 1930s, coronary heart disease, virtually unknown 30 years earlier, became the leading cause of death in the U.S. By 2010, 32% of deaths, or 1 in 3, were due to coronary heart disease. Also from Dr. Chris Kenobi, timeline for cancer deaths in the U.S. 1811 in Boston, less than half of 1% of the deaths, or 5 out of 842 deaths, were due to cancer. That is 1 in 188 deaths. By 1900, 5.8% of the deaths were due to cancer, or 1 in 17 deaths. By 2010, 31.1% of deaths were due to cancer. 1 in 3 deaths now occur as a result of cancer. That is a massive increase, more than a 60-fold increase in deaths related to cancer. So let's look at the leading causes of death in the U.S. Number 1 is heart disease, and number 2 is cancer. At the very center of our metabolic system are our cells and our mitochondrial functions. And so if these diseases that we're experiencing are truly metabolic syndrome diseases that affect the cell and the mitochondria, they should first show up where we have the most mitochondria. And this is exactly the correlation. There are more mitochondria located in the heart muscle than any other organ in the body. The heart works the hardest of any of our organs. So it follows that if metabolic syndrome is truly a mitochondrial dysfunction, disorder, it would show up first and the most in the heart, and it does. It also stands to reason that where the mitochondria and the cardiolipin become damaged by the oxidized linoleic metabolites and other cellular poisons, this would cause apoptosis, which is the programmed cell death, to be impaired, which would mean that cancer would be on a sharp and steady rise as well. And it is. Cancer cells are basically cells with damaged mitochondria and cardiolipin. As an explanation, the cardiolipin makes up approximately 20% of the internal components of the mitochondria. The coordination between the mitochondria and the cardiolipin, one of its primary functions is to control apoptosis, which is the cell maintenance, repair, balance, or programmed cell death. When your cardiolipins are not composed of the proper fatty acids, that cellular function doesn't work properly, and thus it isn't controlling the apoptosis programmed cell death when the cell signals that there is a damaged cell or a irreparable cell that is abnormal and multiplying beyond its genetic instruction. This is how cancer starts, and this is how cancer continues. Another excellent reference by Dr. Chris Kenobi. The U.S. diabetes rate in 1890 was 2.8 persons per 100,000 people. Now, it was much higher in the European countries, but rare in America. Among 35,000 patients under treatment at Johns Hopkins University and dispensary, there were only 10 diabetic cases. When you look at that in relation to the American population at 1890 of 63 million people, there were 1,764 diabetics. That's the equivalent of one little tiny dot in south central Kansas in 1890. By 2016, the diabetic epidemic in the U.S. had increased to 34.1 million people. This is the equivalent of the entire population of these 11 states, or 13% of our population. This is an increase of 4,643-fold over a period of 126 years. Currently, 51% of Americans are either diabetic or pre-diabetic. Only 6.8% of Americans have optimal cardiometabolic health. Section Summary 7. Omega-6 correlation with degenerative disease. In the last 100 years, we have had a dramatic increase in omega-6 linoleic acid consumption, which can also be seen in the human fat tissue. In the last 100 years, we've had a dramatic increase in degenerative diseases, obesity, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and about 60 more. There is a noticeable correlation between the amount of omega-6 or seed oil consumption and the degenerative disease growth. The main causes of death today match with the cellular disorders that are happening because of all of the oxidative stress from our dietary choices.